Funding is provided by a grant from New York State Senator Catherine M. Young, representing Western New York's 57th District with a local office in Olean.
Senior Report is made possible by a grant from Fredonia Place, a continuing care retirement community providing dignity in a modern luxury environment.
From the Access Channel 5 television studio in Mayville, it's Senior Report with Reed Powers. Senior Report is broadcast live throughout northern Chautauqua County on Saturday morning from 9 to 10 a.m. each week. Call in and share a thought, make a comment, ask a question, or simply wish someone a happy birthday on Chautauqua County's only live call-in senior program. Since 1995, Reed has been bringing viewers hundreds of interesting guests, informing the community on a variety of subjects. Here's the host of the show, Reed Powers.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. This is Senior Report. My name is Roy Harvey. I'm your host this particular issue of Senior Report, along with Karen Harvey of Snowshoe Films. We have a special guest here today. It's Professor Taylor Pancoast. He is a professor of chemistry at JCC, and he's been there beginning in about 1983, I believe. He's now a full professor. But first, we have a program in part dedicated to Reed Powers, who's no longer with us. The beautiful morning that Reed always talked about on this show is a little less beautiful without Reed, but we're going to do our best to brighten it up. First, we're going to have Karen read an obituary that was put out by the family. Karen?
I'd like to start by saying, if Reed were here this morning, he would be saying, please, enjoy Chautauqua County. The leeks are up. The leeks are definitely up. You see them? They're beautiful. I'm not going to taste them as Reed would do for you. Thank you for bringing us leeks every spring, Reed. The leeks are coming up. Reed Powers loved his family. He loved his Senior Report, and he loved his community. We respected him for all the work that he did. We will miss him. His commitment to exposing many things that he felt were wrong was very courageous, and our community is better because of what he has done and the service that he has provided and the care that he has given us all. Our dear friend Reed, this is his obituary. Westfield, William M. Reed Powers, age 74, died peacefully Tuesday, April 29th, 2014, at his home, surrounded by his loving family. Reed was born November 8, 1939, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the son of the late Lawrence A. and Matilda Reed Powers. After graduating from high school at Westfield Academy, Reed furthered his education and earned a Ph.D. in education and teaching. He taught as a science teacher at Plainview Central School District in Plainview, New York, retiring in 1984 after 20 years of service. He married the love of his life, Jane Pomeroy, on August 3rd, 1963 in Dunkirk, New York, and together they raised 3 children. Soon after returning to the Westfield area in 1990, Reed began an hour-long radio show every Sunday morning from the WDOE radio studio in Dunkirk, New York, called Senior Report. The show was well received and was videotaped and aired on Public Access Channel 21 each week. In 1995, the show moved to Public Access Channel 5 in Mayville and was aired every Saturday live for 1 hour since its inception. Reed had hosted more than 950 programs and was moving toward his 1,000th show mark. Mr. Powers was a member of the Westfield Fish and Game Club, the John W. Rogers Post 327 American Legion of Westfield, the Loyal Order of Moose Lodge 118 of Westfield, and a member of the Masonic Lodge, and had been a member of the Citizens Hose Company No. 2 of the Fire Department of Westfield for several years, and most recently was a member of the Westfield Firemen's Exempt Association. Reed is survived by his wife, Jane Pomeroy Powers, 2 daughters, Ruth, husband David Dugan, Sarah, husband Mark Powers, and 1 son, James Powers, and 4 wonderful grandchildren, all of Westfield, New York. Survivors also include his sister, Vicki Forsell of Westfield, 1 brother, Don, wife Carolyn Powers, of Roswell, Georgia. At Reed's request, all services will be held privately at the convenience of the family. A special time for reunion and remembrance with food and refreshments will be held Saturday, May 3rd, today, 2014, from 4 till 8 p.m. at the Westfield Moose Lodge, 19 Clinton Street, Westfield, New York. In lieu of flowers, memorials may be made on Reed's behalf to the Alzheimer's Association of Western New York, to the Hospice of Chautauqua County, or to Access Channel 5, Mayville, New York. The arrangements have been entrusted to the Mason Funeral Home. You may call them or email them at masonfuneral.com for a message of sympathy or to light a memorial candle. Once again, Reed was a friend to the entire community. Thank you, Reed.
And now we're going to turn to for a poem, Emily Dickinson. It's going to be read by our dear friend, Linda Spalding. Linda?
Thank you. I chose this poem because I have read this before on this channel for loved ones of the community with their passing on. And it also was a favorite of my husband's. It's by Emily Dickinson, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. I'm doing this in memory of Reed. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children play at wrestling in the ring. We passed the fields of grain. We passed the setting sun. We passed before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the corners but a mound. Since then, 'tis centuries, but each feels shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Thank you, Reed. Thank you for everything that you did.
And thank you, Linda. That really brings up Doug Spalding, our dear friend, too, who was also a part of this channel. Right now, we're going to turn to a call from Ms. Spanos. I think she's on the line right now. Hello?
Good morning.
Good morning. You, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to call in and give my condolences to everyone at the station. Reed is a great guy. I feel very privileged to be a regular guest on his show. I can't help thinking all week. I've been thinking about him, and I kind of came up with what I thought was his theme song for this whole, his passing was that he says, I did it my way. You know, the song, I did it my way, I think really speaks to, Reed's quick passing. I don't think he would have wanted to linger, and it's very sad and shocking for all of us, but I could just hear him singing that.
All right.
And looking down on us. But I really enjoyed all my time with him. We had a lot of sparring episodes, which was great fun, because I kind of had the conservative view, and he had a more liberal view of things. But he paid me a terrific compliment. He said, you really know how to handle me. And I thought that was the highest compliment from Reed. So my condolences to his family and his Channel 5 Access family. He will truly be missed. He really was the voice of seniors in Chautauqua County, making sure that, senior issues were voiced in the public and kept in the public eye. And too many times people of his generation are quiet about their needs, and Reed made sure that their voices were heard. So you did a great job, Reed. We'll miss you.
Well, thank you, Nancy. That was very good. He certainly was a role model for us, and we hope here at Channel 5 we can maintain that kind of excellent openness that Reed had. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're going to turn now to Dr. Taylor Pancoast. The subject this morning is high-volume horizontal fracking. I'd like to first welcome you, Taylor.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, I'll call you Taylor.
That's fine.
You've been teaching chemistry for a good long time. I know one of the things that I talked to Reed several times, and he was really very concerned about the phenomenon of fracking, and we were going to do some shows, and this is a very appropriate kind of discussion and show that Reed would have enjoyed. Tell us about the moratorium right now. Where does New York stand?
Well, New York stands, as it has for quite some time, sort of in limbo. There's a moratorium on the fracking. Cuomo has had a group that's going to put out a report, and so far the results have been postponed from the report several times. So at this point, the moratorium is still in place, and we don't really know what the timetable is for that report to be finally presented. Each time it's set some timetable, it's moved a little further down the road. So at this point, what we can say with great certainty is we don't know.
And your indications are, with regard to the governor and the health department and so forth, the EPA, what is the likelihood of them actually lifting this moratorium and going ahead? It seems industry is pretty much very hopeful that the Utica shale will be a target.
There's a lot of push for that, certainly. I must say I have no better idea than the next person what's actually going to come out of that. There is a lot of push to not have that moratorium lifted. We have a great groundswell of individuals and municipalities working in the other direction. There are a number of towns and other municipalities in New York State which have passed their own bans on fracking, and so I think it's really an open question. There's certainly plenty of opportunity, I think, still for people to help speak out on the issue whichever way they feel. I think it's worth noting that by and large, the forces which are in favor of fracking are looking towards economic development, and largely it's people who stand to make some money or who think they stand to make some money. And a lot of the opposition to that is based on concerns about what happens to our environment as we go through this process. And there is building evidence that there should be some concerns, that this is not a cost-free endeavor. All of our energy costs something, doesn't matter where you get it from. There's going to be some cost associated with it. But I think the cost from the fracking is turning out to be considerably higher than people thought.
Let's distinguish between conventional vertical fracking, which is done around here in the Chautauqua area and New York, and high-volume horizontal fracking. Can you distinguish that?
The high-volume horizontal fracking, so-called, the well goes down into the ground and then it goes horizontally for a significant distance. And so you're fracturing along that horizontal break. Normally, when you put a well down, you're expecting that there's going to be just in the immediate area, there may be some effects. But now when you're talking with the horizontal fracking, you may be traveling quite a significant distance horizontally, and so effects are quite spread out. There have been some recent review studies done that I pulled off of the American Chemical Society Environmental Science and Technology site, in which we're finding increasingly, within about a mile particularly of fracking wells, there seems to be a larger incidence of effects, and that's significant ways away. Normally I think if something's a mile away, I don't have to pay too much attention to it. But that's not the case for this. This is a good, well, it's a longer distance than you might expect.
Right, and that, are you referring to the Barnett, Texas study done on groundwater pollution that was recently, I think it was 2013, that was recent?
Well, that
other studies.
This is a review, several review articles which have been done. Avner Van Goss and Robert Jackson and Nathaniel Warner are the first three people listed. There's quite a significant list. And another one which includes John Adgate and Bernard Goldstein and Lisa McKenzie. So they've been looking at a lot of literature. And so I refer people, they can check with these. Again, these are on environmental science and technology, and they've tried to look at things up through January of 2014. So this is relatively recent that they've compiled this, looking at a lot of different information.
And Karen, do you have a...
Well, when you differentiate between horizontal and just vertical fracking, you also have to differentiate between the layers. We're talking primarily in this area of Marcellus, a black shale, which can produce methane gas. It can only be done economically if they do it in the horizontal fracking way, which is a very large industrial scale operation. Another factor that is different about Marcellus and Utica shales, that'll be the next one down that they will target in this area, is that it is discovered to be highly radioactive. That's how they find it. They drop Geiger counters, gamma counter down the drill hole if it's a horizontal fracking site, and when they have a reaction that shows radioactivity, that's where they know the material that they're looking for is in the Marcellus shale and the Utica shale. When they put down the millions and millions of gallons of water to do the actual fracturing of the rock, the radioactivity of that area, that's not what they're looking for the gas, but the radioactive elements in that shale are dissolved. So when the flowback fluid comes to the surface, it contains what is called norm, which is a normal amount of radioactivity, which is great if it stays underground. But if we bring it up to the surface and don't dispose of it correctly, then we're going to have a problem. I don't know if that comes within the range of chemistry, but I'm looking at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that's pointing out that fracking is now showing evidence of many different radioactive materials, and that everything from barium and radon or radium to antimony 124, bromine 82, iodine 125, iodine 131, iridium 192, and scandium 46. These are all radioactive materials that are elements in Marcellus shale that become part of our surface flowback water to dispose of. What's happening to that wastewater?
Well, let me just start with a couple of things. Every well is different. That's the first thing. You can do studies. They've done studies on two wells side by side, drilled by the same company, and discovered, for example, that the leakage of methane and stuff coming out is an order of magnitude different for the two wells. So it's very difficult to say all wells are a certain way. And what happens in any given well is a function of both the geology locally that the well has been drilled in, and it's a function of how carefully and how well the contractor has followed what they need to follow to put together the casing and drill the well. Having said that, there are some things we can be fairly sure of. As you said, they look for it by the radiation, and at least in the northeast United States, we have a lot of granite in the ground, and the granite tends to have uranium in it, and the uranium over a long period of time decays into a variety of radioactive nuclides. And part of what we're getting is the decay from that. That's a lot of what's going on. We just lost someone, Reed Powers, to lung cancer. The leading cause of lung cancer in this country is smoking, and the second leading cause is radon, which we get from nuclear materials that are in the rock. So the materials that we're pulling up with the fracking fluid are radioactive radon and radium and a variety of things, which, as has been pointed out in a number of places, these low-level quote-unquotes, low-level covers a host of things, but low-level radiation is primarily what's causing cancer, lung cancer, as the second leading cause of lung cancer in this country, at least, and the leading cause for non-smokers. So there's something like 19,000 deaths a year from lung cancer.
Extraordinary.
Attributed to radon.
There are on the order of 750 chemicals, many of which we know about, many of which we don't know about. Could you tell us some of those chemicals, some of the dangerous chemicals, and the Halliburton loophole, so-called?
Well, the Halliburton loophole basically allows fracking companies to put chemicals into the ground which otherwise you would not be able to. I teach at a community college. We run an organic lab. We've run it for many years with micro-scale quantities, which means when we're making something, they might have a gram that they start with, and they might make 350 milligrams of product when they're done. So we've got very small amounts of waste, but that can't go down the drain. We're not allowed to put much of anything down the drain. What goes down the drain in our lab is water. And if the water has metals or it has chemicals in it, can't go down the drain. We have to collect it in waste jars. And so we send off gallon bottles of waste, and we spend thousands of dollars to get those properly disposed of, which means burned up in a facility which monitors what escapes and collects and traps
This
stuff.
is usually where, in Utah and so forth, or the various disposal areas, or their local medical disposals? Or
To tell you the truth, I don't know where we're sending it. I do know that we spend thousands of dollars sending it out, but I don't know the address of the place that we're sending it.
You could just pour it down one of the frack wells and...
Well, apparently you can. I would say we put somewhere between 2 and 9 million gallons of water into a frack well when we frack it. And a very small percentage of that is actually noxious, toxic chemicals that go in. But a small percent of millions of gallons turns out to be a lot of gallons. So one well is putting more chemicals into the ground than my lab would have put in over the lifetime of my tenure career teaching if we just washed everything down the drain. And of course, there'd be big fines if we washed anything down the drain. So here, they can just put hundreds of gallons of stuff. It's diluted, but dilution only just goes so far. We used to think the ocean was big enough that we could dilute it forever. And as early as the 60s, Thor Heyerdahl was trying to show that people could travel to Polynesia by raft, and he took a raft across the ocean and discovered the entire way there were globs of oil from spills and things polluting.
Before Exxon Valdez.
Yeah, this is in the 60s. So we're talking 50 years ago, we had completely polluted the ocean, if you will, in that sense. Now, the Earth takes a lot of stuff and remakes it into other things. It's continually recycling everything. But there are limits. You can put stuff in, you can put garbage in faster than the Earth can clean it up. So we're talking about relatively small amounts perhaps going in, but your term relatively small is hundreds of gallons of stuff going into each well. And there's a lot of different estimates, somewhere between 20 and 80% of that fluid comes back up. And the materials that have been deliberately put into it, there's a whole list. If you go to Frack Focus, which is a site on the web, there's a...
Is that an industry site?
This is a site which industry has reported these materials. This is actually, it's a Groundwater Protection Council, Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission site. So it's kind of a combination of things. So they've listed a whole bunch of things here. Let me just run through a little bit of this. I don't want to get too technical with everything. A lot of it is salts that have been put in. There are biocides, which are designed to make sure that things aren't growing in it. There are breakers, product stabilizers. There are hydrocarbons that are going down. There are things like benzene and related things. A lot of salts, as I said. Things like isopropyl alcohol, methyl alcohol, ethylene glycol, which we know of as antifreeze. They're not good things for us to be consuming. Pretty much my take is if it's not something I can sprinkle on my food, I really don't want to be eating it or breathing it or drinking it in the water. So none of these things are terribly good for you. But in a way, what they're putting in is only the tip of the iceberg, because what's coming back up includes the radioactive material, which is down below, and it includes salts in varying degrees. And the degree of salt you put in, okay, you put some salt in, but what comes up, there's a lot of salt down there too. So what comes up may be, in fact, much saltier than what was put in to begin with. Now, if you read Trojan Wars and stuff, what did they do to the city of Troy when they were done? They salted the earth so nothing could grow. So, putting salt on our roadways and putting fracking fluids on our roadways it's all very well in the winter when we're trying to dissolve the ice, but we pay a price for that in terms of poisoning the land around it.
And also our health. I mean, do you know whether the frack fluid, the flowback, the waste product from Pennsylvania or anywhere else is coming into New York or into Chautauqua County at this point?
I believe that there have been fluids coming in. I don't know at this point if that's still occurring. There have been some difficulties in treating it in waste treatment plants. It turns out that when you start measuring the levels of barium and other metals which are in there, while they're treating the frac fluids, and then you stop taking the frac fluids, those levels in the effluent drop significantly. So there have been some studies done on looking at how much you can take out, and it's difficult because treatment plants are not really geared towards taking out industrial pollutants. Or hydrocarbons. They're geared towards sewage and soaps and stuff like that, which is what we normally get in our water supplies.
In fact, one of the first victims of any radioactive waste, which they're not really monitoring because Geiger counters in the field register gamma, and a lot of this material is alpha and beta. But if you bring radioactive material to a biological waste processing place, the radioactivity will kill the microbes that waste facility depends on to be viable. So the first casualty will be the very waste site that they're putting this material in. And according to the governor's office, they are putting some waste into sites in New York State, as close as Allegheny County, without checking for radioactivity and without having enough regulations to ascertain what's going on there. We're discovering that in Pennsylvania they have contaminated the rivers sufficiently that there's a major study going on by Pennsylvania State University that says high levels of radium directly attributed to hydraulic fracturing are now destroying Philadelphia's, have gotten to the level where Philadelphia's drinking water is in danger. So, they have been doing it there. They're a little preview of what we could expect if we don't get it right for our area.
Thank you, Karen. Just to reiterate that, what they're essentially doing with this radioactivity is destroying the viability of landfills to process normal waste, isn't it? I mean, it's deadening them.
Well, there are microbes there that are used to make this all back to normal. I mean, I don't know the technical aspects of it, but they're live creatures that are in the mix. And if you put in a little bit of radioactivity, you kill those creatures, just like it would kill us or, the fish in the river. So you can't even dispose of regular disposable things if you've compromised the formula for the what is it called, the deterioration of the things until they become non-toxic. Toxic is the question here. You've got biological toxic and then you've got chemical toxic. So chemistry can help us understand that. Can you elaborate?
Well,
Before we have a call. Perhaps we ought to get to that right now. Caller, are you on the line?
Yes. My question, we're obviously putting a lot of chemicals down in these wells. Is the reactions taking place so that we're getting more inert or even more dangerous stuff out than what we're putting in?
Good question.
actually, the answer is yes. One of the things that happens is we're putting a lot of salts and halogens down, and inside, in the ground, when you have halogens and methanes, what you are creating is trihalomethanes, chloroform, bromoform, CH3, CCl3H, and CHBr3. And these are carcinogenic materials. They lead to leukemias of various kinds, and so they're not good things at all. So yes, that sort of thing is taking place, particularly forming, as I said, the trihalomethanes. There may be other things. One of the big points being made in both of these studies is there's a need for a lot more study. There just isn't very much known. Many of the chemicals that we're putting in the ground, we don't even know what they are because they're proprietary. That somebody has said, we're going to not disclose what's in here because the other groups who are fracking might want to use our mix without paying us royalties and all that, and we don't want to help the competition. So I understand that. But it makes it more difficult to actually monitor and keep track of what's going on. But yes, there are reactions going on that are creating new substances that weren't in the original injection.
One of the things I'd like to get your take on is, I understand up to 8, and you actually clarified this somewhat, but up to 8 million gallons of water per well. And you have, say, 6 wells on a pad. And then when you add that, it's up to 40,000 gallons of chemicals, 750 or so, different kind of chemicals. You've got not only polluted water, but toxic water.
Oh, yes.
And would you speak to the question of just this incredible pull of our fresh water and turning it into waste or toxic water?
There are a couple of things that are going on. First of all, you put this down in the ground, it becomes even more toxic after it comes back up because it's picked up additional salts, it's picked up additional radioactivity. And then what do we do with it? Where do we go with this water? Now, some of it has just been spread on the roads, and some of it has been put through waste treatment plants, and some of it has been injected down into deep wells that aren't being used anymore, so that's a sequestration. And some of it is being actually reused for fracking. That's actually happening, which is a good thing in my mind. If you're going to do the fracking, I'd rather see you reuse the fluid that way than contaminate new water. Let's start with the stuff which just gets spread on the roads. Now, you can claim that it's all relatively dilute, but as you spread stuff like that, the water evaporates, and what you're leaving behind are the radioactives and the heavy metals and the salts. And so over time, you're building up a level of toxicity in the soil. And the longer you do it, the more toxicity you build up. Is anybody monitoring just how much salt and how much heavy metals and how much radioactivity is in the water that's being spread? Well, I think the short answer is, for the most part, no. So you're spreading stuff without necessarily knowing what you're spreading. Some of it's done illegally, some of it's done legally, thinking, hey, this is free salt, so we can clean up our roads in the winter and goody-goody, but that's got a price attached to it. You are spreading poison on the land, literally, when you do that. Some of it is being set in settling ponds, frack ponds so-called. The fluid can be extremely toxic. There have been cases of cattle being killed because they were directly exposed to fracking fluids. Certainly there have been leaks from ponds and things like that. So,
and these are plastic liners, essentially, right? I mean,
there are plastic liners on them. They are You're evaporating the water off, you're hoping. Of course, if you've got chemicals like benzene and things like that, that's evaporating off too. So that, any chemical waste, trihalomethanes and benzenes and other things like that, ethylene glycols, to whatever extent those are there, as the water evaporates, so do they. They don't stay behind. What stays behind is heavy metals and to some extent radioactive materials.
But some radioactive material does get aerosolized and is
Yes.
bioaccessible because it's in the air. So we're having access to it both breathing and drinking, as well as agriculturally.
That is correct. There is, as I said earlier, there's evidence that most of the health effects are within about a mile of the fracking wells. But if you look at a map of where the fracking wells are and the places where they're fracking, who's not within a mile of a fracking well? Well, pretty much everybody's within a mile of a fracking well. So that suggests to me that if you have large-scale fracking going on in the places where you're allowing it, you can expect to see these kind of health effects. We just had recently, I think it was in Texas, where a couple sued a fracking company and won a $3 million settlement, which of course will be appealed. Most of the time when people have health effects from fracking, the company settles and they get a non-disclosure agreement signed so that people can't talk about it. So, for a long time the fracking companies were saying, oh, there's never been a leak. You can't show where we've ever contaminated somebody's water. Well, that's what happens if you arrange it so that anybody who's had their water contaminated is not allowed to talk about it. So they could make that statement knowing, oh, we paid off all the people who might say otherwise. Now we have a situation where, for whatever reasons, a particularly irresponsible fracking company chose not to pay them off. I say irresponsible in that they allowed these people to suffer these health effects with what they were doing. They were shoddy in the way that they drilled things. And even if you do a good job of putting the cementing in and sealing things up, there's significant evidence that you know that a certain percentage of the wells are going to frack and are going to break and leak, and that percentage goes up over time. And when I say significant percentages, we're talking like half the wells, maybe, okay, over time. So this is not just one or two.
That's industry. The industry's facts say 5% initially, and over 30 years, 50% of all well housing or infrastructure will fail. They call it failing, will leak to some degree. Whether it leaks into a water supply or not is another question, but it's still, their statistics prove that these annuluses are not foolproof. They just do not protect us completely.
I'd like to go back a little bit to the Halliburton loophole, the Cheney loophole, or the Bush loophole, however you want to call it. 2004, essentially the EPA did a study, and perhaps you could tell us about the study, the study on water, and then what led to essentially the Cheney-Bush administration creating this loophole for fracking.
I'm not conversant with the specific.
Well, the 2004
study
really was an EPA study that said there was no danger from groundwater well pollution, and the the Bush administration ran with that in 2005 and did the Halliburton.
Clearly, that was a study which was in the absence of any facts.
You know, it's the whole process of essentially dumbing down science and making it, adjusting it to what the needs of industry is what's going on here.
Actually, that's not dumbing down science so much as not doing science.
Okay.
You might recall we had a big
they called
battle.
It Bush science back
right,
then.
Okay.
Right?
We had a big battle with the tobacco companies some decades back. And you could turn on the TV and there'd be some doctor saying, yeah, you should smoke. It'll relax you, and being relaxed is good for your health. Well, the statement being relaxed is good for your health is true, but the notion that you're going to smoke cigarettes to get that relaxation is a net loss in your health, because you're going to get lung cancer probably and emphysema and a variety of other things. But they got medical doctors to just, you say this, we'll pay you. So you can get almost anybody to say almost anything if you pay them enough. So the fact that they were making those statements about what's going to happen when we do the fracking process before we'd done anything, simply suggest that they paid some people some money and those people were willing to take their money and say what they were told to say. That's not science. Science is you go out and you look at what's happening and you study, here's an example of a well, let's go see what's going on. And in the case of fracking, it's clear that what goes on depends tremendously on the individual geology of the area, and it depends on the technology used to frack the well. So some companies are using better technology and others are not using such good technology, or perhaps they're just cutting corners. But there's not a single well that you can point to and say they're all like this one. And so clearly, given what we know now, that study, if it said, hey, there's not going to be any contamination, that's just wrong.
Well, there was a subsequent study. In fact, the EPA subsequently said that 2004 study whitewashed the industry and was dismissed by experts as superficial and politically motivated.
Yep.
The subsequent study has indicated extremely significant concerns about HVHF, and there is an act before Congress which apparently the gas and oil industry is very much opposed to because it's sitting in committee. It's called the Fracturing Responsibility Awareness and Chemicals Act, which calls for the disclosure of the chemicals that are being used. These industries do not, based on their privacy claims, do not let us know what exactly they're using, and they have, under that previous administration, been allowed exemptions under the Clean Air and Clean Water Act as an industry as a whole. Now, like you said, even the chemistry department can't put things down. Right. Agriculture, industry of all sorts, must comply with the rules established by this country for clean air and clean water. However, the Halliburton loophole allows the gas and oil industry to be exempt from certain aspects of those laws that protect our water and air. But if this little, if you shorten Fracturing Responsibility and Awareness Chemicals Act, it spells frack. I mean, so but it's sitting in limbo. They say 6% chance of ever coming out of committee. We need to push for that kind of thing. And Schumer's one of the ones that has pushed it, and so is another person, Maurice Hinchey, Representative Maurice Hinchey.
Former representative, I believe.
Oh, okay. Yes, this is dated. I'm probably got unelected because he pushed hard for doing the right thing.
Yeah, you know, to continue along those lines with the EPA has been variously trying to do various studies. The Wyoming study, for example. Can you talk about that, or shall I?
I'll let you talk about that.
Basically, they did an extraordinary study. It was talking on the groundwater. They almost completed the study. It was something like a 2-year study. In 2013, they dropped the study, turned it over to the state of Wyoming, and washed their hands of any kind of look because they were just getting too dangerous, too critical of the whole frack process. And that's what's been happening with the EPA. The industry points to the EPA and says they're doing the studies and everything is fine, but essentially you have a problem, which is essentially the continuity of the Bush administration's corruption in 2004 with the Clean Water Act, which is what the Halliburton loophole was about.
It's worth pointing out that it's extremely difficult to convince someone whose livelihood depends on a fact that that fact is damaging things. We don't want to hear it.
All right.
You know?
And you know, the extraordinary and ironic thing is that these people who are in the industry are going to be the ones that are first sick.
That's correct.
You know? And we've seen spills, for example, on those individuals, and they were hospitalized, and it was in Pennsylvania, one major case, where the doctors couldn't get the information about what was in the frac fluid. And the person almost died, and finally they got the information, but that's a proprietary thing.
Right.
And it's a gag order on the medical industry. Perhaps you can speak to that.
Well,
gag order.
Clearly, because these things are proprietary, it is very difficult to treat someone when you don't know what the issue is. And so that speaks for itself. If I don't know what's poisoning you, it makes it much more difficult for me to know how to treat that poisoning. I guess I'm going to suggest that everything is related. We just heard recently some studies that were done out of Harvard suggesting that the United States is now an oligarchy. right? That if they looked at public policy and they said, okay, the public wants this and this and this, how much of that showed up in legislation? Zero correlation. No correlation to what the public wanted compared to what shows up in legislation. So what was pushing the legislation? Well, corporate interests. Money talks. Big money. What are the most powerful economic interests on this planet? Oil and gas companies. They're far and away the most profitable thing that's ever been invented. They make more money than many countries, right? So they have tremendous push. So this is part of the gas and oil. There are attempts being made in some parts of the country to penalize homeowners for putting solar panels on their house because they don't want stuff to compete with gas and oil. Now, whether you agree with climate change or not, okay, it's clear that the climate is changing. You can talk about how and why, but clearly it is changing. And as long as we have very powerful interests who make a huge amount of money and have that as a resource, who are free to say, you know, I'm going to pay this person here to say black is white. And that goes on. We have in the scientific literature large numbers, thousands of researchers who are saying climate change is real and it's driven in part by man-made contributions to it. Methane gas is something like 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And just recently we passed the threshold where the methane is now doing more greenhouse activity than the carbon dioxide. So that's just happened fairly recently.
And the source of it is coal and gas.
Coal and gas and energy.
The 30% of it is attributable to them,
Right.
and that's the number one biggest contributor. The second one is agriculture, because animals and so forth. But
So we're in
number
the
one.
same place here, I think, that we were at the tobacco companies 40 years ago. We have a large, very wealthy group which makes tremendous amounts of money, and they can afford to pay people to say whatever they want them to say.
Yeah.
And if my livelihood depends, if my job depends on saying A, then I'm going to say A for most people. It's very hard to walk away from that.
Right. And when you consider, when you're talking about oligarchy as a primary political system that we have devolved into, it's illustrated, it seems to me, in part by Fukushima. We have essentially a large radiation problem, and yet our government is adding, parts of our government are adding more radiation problems with with fracking. Because, have you looked into the Fukushima effect on our potential health? Across the globe?
Fukushima is the reactor in Japan. And ironically, it wasn't the reactor itself which is causing all of this. It's the storage pools where they put their spent rods. And this is happening every reactor on the planet, as far as I know. We still, in this country, and I don't know that it's any different anywhere else, do not have a place to put radioactive materials from storage from nuclear plants. So those spent fuel rods go into a storage pond right on site, and that's what they have in Japan too. They had a storage pond, and it's the storage pond which had the meltdown. And it hasn't been in the news, but it's leaking radiation, as far as I know, at about the same rate it was leaking radiation when it first happened. It's just going into the ocean. And you don't hear anything about it because the government covers it up there, and we're not trying to make waves with their government, so we don't say anything about it. When I was in graduate school, and subsequently, Chernobyl was always held up as, okay, this is the biggest reaction accident that we've had for a nuclear power plant. And we've had 3 Mile Island, which was a close call, but Chernobyl was the cat's meow for what you want to avoid. And Fukushima is way past Chernobyl. It's a continuing event, and most people are completely unaware of that fact. So how long will it take us to significantly affect the planet, dropping radioactive materials into the ocean at the speed with which we're doing it over in Japan? I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you that the past practice we have, with the example we have of oil polluting the ocean, suggests that it's not that long. So we can choose to think about just our own lifetimes, or we can choose to think about our children and our grandchildren's lifetime, and I think that might give us a slightly different perspective as to what we should be doing in these situations. The fracking is a big problem right now in terms of what it's doing to the health of the people living in the areas where we're doing the fracking, but it's also a long-term global problem. And it isn't just fracking here. People are thinking of doing fracking in other countries. Other people have shale with oil in it and stuff. So part of it is, what are we going to do as a planet to make our energy come from places where it won't be damaging our living space? Now, we have plenty of histories of societies which didn't succeed in taming their own excesses. Easter Island, where they had a population which grew, and at some point they ended up using up most of their wood, which was sustaining them. They could build boats and go out and fish and stuff, and they ended up, through a number of things, destroying all their woods and their trees, and they no longer had any. And then the population dove. They had disease, they had warfare, because people couldn't face the problem, so they fought each other for how. Do we really want to go there with planet Earth? I don't want to see that now. Maybe I'm old enough I won't, but I don't want my kids to see that. I don't want my grandkids to see that.
No, it's a terrible legacy to leave the future planet. The industry itself talks about containment, how the large machines are containing the whole process. Have you looked into those kinds of claims? I mean, it seems to discount the tremendous volume of trucks growing with water, with sand, with chemicals.
Let's forget about the big picture for a minute. Let's just look at a fracking well, right? So you're putting between 2 and 9 millions of gallons in there, and I don't know how much a truck holds, 30,000 gallons or something, I don't know, but you're talking hundreds of truckloads, literally. So these big trucks are driving on the roads, so you're damaging the roads. The more trucks you have, the more accidents you have, and so the more spills and things like that you have. The more you do it, the more you're exposing the people around that well to the frac fluids, and not just the frac fluids, but to the methane gas coming up. Methane gas is not, quote, a toxin in the sense that, say, cyanide is. A little bit isn't going to drop you dead. But it is something that you don't want to be breathing large amounts of. No hydrocarbons are things you want to be breathing large amounts of. These things do damage your system, your body, biologically, over the long term. People end up with lesions. People end up with all kinds of very bad news events. So you don't want to be breathing this stuff. You don't want to be in an area where this is coming out. Now, this is quite apart from any of the long-term stuff in terms of climate change and stuff like that. This is just, here we have plenty of evidence that a fair amount of the fracking wells end up leaking stuff, and a fair number of the people who are near these things end up being poisoned by it. Is everybody who's around it? No, I can't say that absolutely everybody is. Maybe you'll be lucky. Maybe the wells near you won't leak, and maybe it won't get you. It depends on the geology. It depends on the company doing it. But there's certainly no guarantee that it's going to be safe if it happens near you. There's every possibility that there can be a whole host of things going on. One of the more interesting things that happens is when they do this injection of the water down into the wells that they're just plugging to get rid of the frac fluids, they've had to stop that in some places because it's creating little earthquakes. There's an apparently never-ending stream of consequences from this, which whoever was thinking about earthquakes, nobody was even contemplating that was going to be happening when they first started talking about this.
Well, there's a picture here that shows it's a good example. Well, this is a frac operation. When they're initially beginning it, they need 10,000 psi of pressure of that water. It takes this many diesel engines to create that 10,000 psi's. Those things have to be brought in. They use a great deal of diesel fuel. That diesel fuel in turn goes into the air. The sound that they make is, you can just imagine what that's like. Now this is a typical Pennsylvania HVHF fracking site. This is the kind of thing you see for each. Now they can go 6 wells per pad, they can go up to 21 wells per pad. They have to clear a lot of space and they have to put in a lot of equipment to do this.
And another thing too that I've just recently learned, perhaps you know about this, Taylor, is that they can frack up to 20 times. Mm-hmm. So if they go down to a seam, they don't like that seam, they can go to a different level. So essentially this process is not a one-time deal necessarily.
That's correct.
You can keep on going and going.
Yes, that's exactly right. There's no guarantee that they're going to frack it once. Yes, you can frack it multiple times.
Another aspect, and I'd like to get your comment on, is that the actual frack process, when they use the perf charges actually down the 2 miles or whatever in there, the series of perf charges, Halliburton owns the patent for depleted uranium. And they advertise, they talk about how valuable this particular DU frac perf charge is over plastic. That sort of thing would come back up, depleted uranium. So essentially, we're getting depleted uranium as a process. What is depleted uranium?
It's radioactive. I guess it's no longer power plant fuel rods. So when they say it's depleted, that suggests that some of it has already gone through its half-life. But it's still uranium, it's still radioactive, and as we've already seen, there's a lot of radioactive material down there which the fracking fluids are bringing up even without the depleted uranium. So this is just adding to that burden. We should understand that low levels of radiation are very dangerous. They create, well, radiation creates free radicals. And in your body, these free radicals basically latch on to the normal molecules that the biochemistry of your body uses, and it turns what was a useful molecule into something which is now a toxic poison. It's now something your body has to get rid of. So you're poisoning yourself with free radicals, and you can hear lots of advertisements for eat this food or eat that because it's a radical scavenger. What happens is that low levels of radiation leads to cancer in the long term. And it's extremely insidious because if you get food poisoning in a restaurant, you say, oh, I'm sick the next day, what did I eat last night? But if you get cancer from low-level radiation exposure, well, this could be a year later, it could be 10 years later. I don't have any way of even beginning to figure out where my exposure came from. I can't see the radiation, I can't taste it, I can't feel it. In order for you to actually see radiation, it has to be so intense that if you could see that, you're probably dead, right?
And some of these are bone seekers too, I mean, leukemias and so forth.
That's correct.
Taylor, we are out of time. Karen, and thank you very much for this. We are out of time with our program. We want to salute Reed Powers. He is the champion of this program since 1985, along with Chuck Kelsey, the creators of Senior Report. And I want to again thank Taylor Pancoast. He is a chemistry professor at JCC and fully aware of the dangers of low volume, high volume horizontal fracking. And thank you for watching. If you have any questions, a good site is ProPublica, and you have others that...
Well, Frac Focus will give you some information, and you can go online and simply look up, but be careful. Industry sites are industry sites, and they have an axe to grind. They want to make money.
Right. Well, thank you again, too.